You're not afraid of the dark, are you?
Peace to everyone out there that's tuning in to the Dark Warrior Perspective YouTube channel. Of course, it's Dark Warrior himself. And we're going to do something different today. Normally, you see me, create some type of video to showcase some of our history, or I may do a book review. So today I wanted to do a PowerPoint. Now, the PowerPoint that I'm going to present to you is something I did some time back. I normally do this when I'm invited locally to some of the cultural centers to do before the people. But I wanted to illustrate it to everyone on the YouTube channel so you can also get a bit of this information. It's, um, it's, it's, it's not extremely brief, but it's not extremely detailed. It's enough to kind of get you started and to wet your whistle on the history. So today's presentation is Blacks in the Revolutionary War, the Untold Heroes. And this particular subject matter stood out to me because I really wanted people to appreciate, what blacks had contributed to the Revolutionary War in establishing what we now call the United States of America. So, no further ado, let's get started with the presentation. So, we have blacks in the Revolutionary War. All right, in my opinion, the Revolutionary War had begun because of this case right here, the Somerset Stewart case. And what really made the Somerset and Stewart case propel the division between England and the colonies of America is such. Now, in 1772, the English court it held the fact that chattel slavery was unsupported by the common law in England and Wales. All right. 2 years prior to this, a particular incident had taken place. A man by the name of James Somerset was an enslaved African who was purchased by Charles Stewart. And Charles Stewart was a customs officer in Boston, Providence, Massachusetts, or up in we call Boston, Massachusetts today, which was under the British colony. Okay, it was still under control of the British. And what happened was they returned to England in 1769. And 2 years later, Somerset escaped in 1771. Okay? After he was recaptured, Stewart, Stewart had him imprisoned. He had Somerset imprisoned. He shipped him to Jamaica, Anne and Mary in Jamaica. Okay? And he was shipped by a man by the name of Captain John Knowles, and he placed him on a plantation. The Chief Justice of the King's Bench, William Murray the First, he was the Earl of Mansfield. He ordered a hearing for January the 21st, and of course, by that time, Somerset was released of his enslavement. February the 7th of 1772, this hearing had began. All right? So let's just put it in perspective. 1769, Charles Stewart enslaved James Somerset. Somerset escaped slavery. Later on, sent to Jamaica unlawfully. And the English court felt as though that this was not supported by the common law in England and Wales, so they set up a hearing in 1772. The major backer for the Somerset case was a man by the name of Granville Sharp. Granville Sharp was an abolitionist, and I don't and I'll say this: not enough European abolitionists get enough credit for their contributions in freeing the African slave. There's some pros and cons to it, but some of them did step up to help free the African of his bondage. He was the first English campaigner for abolition of the slave trade, and he also formulated a plan to settle black people in Sierra Leone, you see. And his efforts eventually established Freetown, Sierra Leone. So you can see There are some questions behind that. How are you going to then say that someone cannot be, enslaved? But we're going to send you to a country called Sierra Leone. We're going to establish a country called Sierra Leone. This is where we think you should be. And there's some history behind that too. All right, but we're not going to get into that today. Somerset's advocates argue that while colonial laws might permit slavery, neither the common law of England nor any law made by Parliament recognized the existence of slavery, and therefore it's unlawful. In other words, the colonial laws in North America may recognize slavery, but we don't recognize that in the common law here in England, in the Parliament. So now you're starting to see there's some divisiveness being created. And Charles Stewart, he had his two lawyers argue that property was paramount, slavery was needed, and that it would be dangerous to free all the black people in England, who at the time is approximately like 15,000 of them. And here's a news clipping that I found regarding the case of James Somerset, a Negro, on a habeas corpus King's Bench. Habeas corpus meaning like bring the body. Okay, it's Latin, and this was dated 1771 to 1772. As you can see down here on the bottom left, on the 3rd of December 1771, affidavits were made by Thomas Walkland and Elizabeth Cade and John Marlowe that James Somerset, a Negro, was confined in irons on a boarded ship called the Anne and Mary, and John Knowles, the commander, lying in Thames and bound for Jamaica. All right, so they were putting it in the newspaper that they were sending this African man to Jamaica under the guidance, if you will, of Charles Stewart. All right. Or the command of Charles Stewart. Now, this man right here, Lord Mansfield, he was the justice at the time. He was on the bench at the time regarding this. And I'm going to show you something that really made him attach himself to his decision on the case. You see, you have these two ladies right here. You have the white woman by the name of Elizabeth Murray, and then you have Dido Belle on the left hand side. Why am I showing you this? Okay. Dido Elizabeth Belle, she was born into slavery as a natural daughter of Maria Belle, which was an enslaved African woman in the British West Indies. And a man by the name of Sir John Lindsay, a British career naval officer, was stationed there. And he took her with him to England in 1765 and entrusted her to be raised by his uncle, William Murray, the first Earl of Mansfield. And Belle was raised free and educated alongside with their biological niece, Elizabeth Murray. Okay? And Belle lived there for 30 years. Lord Mansfield, he in his will of 1793 confirmed that Dido Belle, the black woman, free and provided an outright sum and an annuity to her, making her an heiress. She was a female benefactor of the inheritance, a beneficiary of the inheritance. So as you can see, this is why he was attached to Dido Belle so much. He adopted her, and she became related to their biological niece, Elizabeth Murray. Now let's move forward. On June 22nd, 1772, Stewart stated no claim on contract. He declares the Negro as a slave and mentions the purpose of sending Somerset over to Jamaica. So he admits it. He said, there's nothing wrong with it. Stewart stated, let justice be done, whatever be the consequences. So Sir Philip York and Mr. Talbot declared themselves as British planters or farmers, and he gave them legal justification to bring slaves into the kingdom and baptize them. Lord Hardwicke, sitting as Chancellor in October the 19th, 1749, stated, if a slave came to England or became a Christian, he thereby became emancipated. But there was no foundation in the law of the notion. So that's what a lot of Europeans were in fear of, that if we start Christianizing the African, then they would then be not only free, but they will also see themselves as equal to us. And there's some history behind that too, on where the courts and the churches, the state and the churches were coming together to set up some parameters that we're going to Christianize the African, but we're still going to keep them in bondage. The planters, knowing that the slave could become free by becoming a Christian, oftentimes prevented it from happening. Lord Mansfield gave his opinion in court, encouraging the parties to come to a settlement by letting Somerset go free. So he's like, listen, let's go ahead and let the man go. All right? Because remember, he's attached to a black woman. They come out with the Trinity term, June 22nd, 1772, often used for the sitting of the High Court of Justice of England between June 9th and July 31st. It's also known the Trinity sitting. Okay. Later on, Somerset was free. This case decided only that a slave could not be forcibly removed from England against his or her will. Mansfield stated that the Somerset case only determined that a master could not force a slave to leave England. The Thames Dighton case was a black woman by the name of Charlotte Howe, who was brought to England as a slave by Captain Howe. And after he died, she sought relief or help, but was not entitled to relief under the poor law, which was for the hired, not the slave. So they had the poor law that was strictly for indentured servants, not for slaves. So she could not be granted her freedom because of that. But slavery was eventually abolished by the Slavery Abolition Act in 1807. And this was an act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom prohibiting slave trade in the British Empire. Okay? However, merchants still continued to trade slaves 61 years after the Mansfield decision. And the abolitionists argued that the law of England should apply on English ships and even in the colonies. So now you're seeing that the colonies were under British rule. And they felt as though if you're going to pass the law in England, then that law should also be effect in the Americas, under the British colonies. And this is where the problem started to begin. We're going to take a short break, and I'll be right back, okay? Okay, so sorry about that. We're back for a short break. Now, let's get into how it began sparking this dominoes effect. In 1773 to 1774, several slaves filed freedom suits based on the Mansfield ruling. So they're getting word of the fact that, hey, they're freeing slaves over in England. What about us here in the Americas? It was supported by the colony's general court for freedom of the slaves, but it was vetoed by the successive royal governors. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery colonies, for opposition reasons, wanted a break from English laws in order to maintain slavery. That's how you saw the divisiveness. This is where began the issue between the colonies here in the Americas and England. It was over slavery. Thus, as you can see, the beginning of the Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. And eventually, just side note on the bottom right here, a Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, the Parliament abolished slavery in most colonies, freeing more than 800,000 enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, South Africa, as well as small number in Canada. Okay? So, let's get to the first hero. Now that you know the bit of, in my humble opinion, okay, the bit of the history on why slavery had began. Let's start getting into the heroes. Not slavery began, but why the Revolutionary War had began. Let's get into the heroes of the Revolutionary War, okay, and their contributions on both the British side and the American side. So, James Armistead, 1760 to 1830, was considered an American hero. He was James Armistead Lafayette, and the reason being is because we're going to go to a bit of his bio. He was an African American born in New Kent County, Virginia, or Elizabeth City. And he served in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War under Marquis de Lafayette. That's how he got his name. And he was a double agent. What he would do was pose as a runaway, and he joined with the Brigadier General Benedict Arnold. All right. He defected to the British of Lord Cornwallis during the Battle of Yorktown, and he documented info of the British plans and delivered it to the American spies. So, in other words, he pretty much was doing what Benedict Arnold doing. He turned his back on the British. He would go over, get information for what the British was doing. He posed as a runaway. He would go over there, get their information, bring it back, give it to the Americans. And, of course, the British was eventually defeated at Yorktown because of his dedication and loyalty on the behalf of the Patriots. Okay? Peter Salem, 1750 to 1816. Right here in this picture, you'll see Peter Salem. Some racist, biased historians will state that he was cowering behind the white man with the sword. Common sense would usually kick into anyone that says that normally someone with a rifle is not going to cower behind the white man with a sword. He's actually supporting him. It is betraying the support of his support during the war. That's Peter Salem. He was an African American born in slavery in Framingham, Massachusetts, and he was freed later. He was a soldier in the American Revolutionary War, 4th Continental Regiment, and 6th Massachusetts Regiment. He fought at Bunker Hill, and he shot and killed the British Marine Major Jonas Picard. All right, so he shot a bigwig, a British Marine Major. You had Barcelli Lou, 1743 to 1822. He was an African American. He was a soldier in the Revolutionary War in the 27th Regiment of Chelmsford, Massachusetts. He was a soldier, a fifer, and a drummer. Fifer is someone who plays like the flute, the little flute, the recorder that they have. And he also too fought at Bunker Hill. Okay. You have Prince Whipple, 1750 to 1796. Prince Whipple. You see this picture right here. You may have seen this picture before. This is George Washington. They are crossing the Delaware River. We're gonna scan in closer. You see this black man right here? This is Whipple. This is a close-up of Whipple help rowing the boat. Okay? He was an African American originally from Ghana. He and his brother was purchased by Portsmouth, New Hampshire men. He was a slave and later a freeman in 1781 by General William Whipple during the war. That's how he got his name, of course. Accompanied by General Whipple and George Washington in the above painting crossing the Delaware River. He fought at the Battle of Trenton in Trenton, New Jersey during the Revolutionary War. All right? That's who he was. When you see that ship, you see that boat, that's a black man helping them fight during the Revolutionary War crossing the Delaware River. And here's some of the names right here. A couple of them I mentioned. The first one, Barcelli Lou. You had Peter Salem over here to your right. So these are some of the famous people that you'll, all black, who fought on the behalf of the Patriots against the British. Prince Estabrook, 1741 to 1830. He was a slave residing in Lexington, who as a Lexington Minuteman was at the Buckman Tavern awaiting the arrival of British regulars at dawn on April the 19th, 1775. Through circumstance and destiny, Prince Estabrook became the first black soldier to fight in the American Revolution. In that action, he was wounded at Lexington Green, and of course, a monument was dedicated to him. And here's a closer one of here. Here's a closer look at the monument of him engraved in a plaque on a stone. All right. He was an enslaved black man and a Minuteman private, and he belonged to Benjamin Estabrook. What is a Minuteman? A Minuteman are civilian colonists who independently organized to form a well-prepared militia, and they were self-trained in weaponry and tactics. That sounds familiar. You still have your modern-day militias doing so who has an issue with government. And he fought and was wounded at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and this was the first battle of the Revolutionary War. He enlisted in the Lexington militia in 1773, and he served until 1783. And he was later emancipated by his master following his service in the Continental Army, and he was buried at the First Parish Church in Ashby, Massachusetts. Okay, these are all patriots. Remember that. They fought on the behalf of the colonists here in North America. You have a lady by the name of Phoebe Fraunces, who didn't necessarily fight on the battlefield, but she did make a significant contribution to the war, and we're going to get into that. From 1775 to 1836 is her lifespan. Phoebe, there was a book called Phoebe the Spy, black woman. Let's give a little history about the Fraunces Tavern. After the American Revolutionary War, on December the 4th, 1783, General Washington bade an emotional farewell to his officers at a banquet held in a long room located on the second floor of this tavern. It was owned by Samuel Fraunces, who was a West Indian innkeeper, and he was the proprietor of the property. Okay. The Fraunces was a West Indian background. Phoebe Fraunces' father, Samuel Fraunces, he owned the famous tavern in New York in 1755. Many historians in the 19th and 20th century described him as, in 1838, they called him a Negro man. 1878, they called him swarthy. 1916, a mulatto. Once again, in 1916, he was a Negro. In 1930, he was colored. Then, of course, 1934, Fadistas, an old Negro. And then, of course, in 1962, they called him an Haitian Negro. All of these were a description of how he looked. I emphasize that because when you go to look up Samuel Fraunces, oftentimes they're going to portray him as being extremely white, to the point that he's not even black, because they don't want to give credit. Washington's headquarters from April the 17th to April the 27th in 1776 was Richmond Hill. That was 2 miles north of the tavern. That's why they would come down to meet. This is prior to them going to Philadelphia and then eventually establishing the capital in Washington, D.C. What happened was, what made Phoebe Fraunces so significant is Thomas Hickey was one of Washington's lifeguards. He poisoned Washington's food, trying to kill him. Samuel Fraunces' daughter, Phoebe Fraunces, became romantically involved in Thomas Hickey. He wanted her to go in with the plot, but she informed Washington or her father, one of the two, and the plan was eventually foiled. So Thomas Hickey eventually was court-martialed and hanged. So guess what? She saved George Washington's life. That's what makes her so significant. She saved his life, and that wasn't the first time there was an attempted murder on him, or attempted assassination. I'm sorry. Then you have Crispus Attucks, 1723 to 1770. The start of the American Revolution was initiated on this day in 1770, which was become the Boston Massacre. The violence started that night when an angry crowd led by Crispus Attucks confronted a group of British soldiers. Remember, they are patriots at this time. One in which was accused of striking a boy with the butt of his rifle. Panicked by the mob, the soldiers shot into the crowd, killing 5 people. The first, which was Attucks. So the British killing some of the patriots, including him. Okay? This is a portrayal of the Boston Massacre. This is Crispus Attucks in the center. He was an African stevedore, or what they call a docker, and a sailor. He thought to be the first to be killed in the Boston Massacre. Referred to as the first American killed in the American Revolution, evidence suggests his father, Prince Younger, was African-born slave, and his mother, Nancy Pinter Attucks, was a Native American. She was from the Natick tribe. So he was mixed Native American and African. The fall of 1768, British soldiers were sent to Boston to take control of colonial unrest. Why? They had introduced the Stamp Act of 1765. This was an act of the Parliament of Great Britain imposing direct tax on the colonies of British America. So they're strong-arming the patriots in North America. Then they introduced the Townshend Act of 1767. They started taxing glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea by the British. Third, the American Whigs, the colonists who rebelled against the British control during the Revolutionary War. So the British, in other words, were still taxing and putting a lot of strain on the colonists here in the Americas because they're still under the British rule. March the 5th, 1770, a crowd of colonists confronted the soldier who did not pay his barber bill. And of course, once the smoke cleared, 5 colonists was killed and 6 were wounded. Attucks took 2 ricocheted bullets to the chest, and he later succumbed to his injuries. All right. Now, we talked about the Patriots. We introduced some of the Black Patriots who was fighting on behalf of the American soldiers here in the American colonists here in the Americas. Now we got to get into the Loyalists. The Loyalists were black people who joined forces with the British against the colonists. Let's get into the history of that. Black Loyalist was a United Empire Loyalist living in British America of African descent who joined the British colonial military forces during the Revolutionary War. Many were slaves held by Patriot Americans who joined the British in exchange for the crowd's promise of freedom. 3,000 black loyalists were evacuated from New York to Nova Scotia. Some of the loyalists who migrated to Nova Scotia brought enslaved African Americans with them at a total sum of 2,500. Many more slaves escaped from plantations in the British colonies and the new U.S. to British lines. When the British evacuated, they took some black loyalists to London and included in the black poor. Okay? 4,000 blacks were transported from London for resettlement to colony of Sierra Leone in 1787. 5 years later, after 1,192 black loyalists from Nova Scotia chose to migrate to Sierra Leone as they were tired of discrimination and the climate in Canada. In your modern day Sierra Leone Creole people, the Creoles are their descendants. Okay? So if you ever see, when you start looking into the Creoles people, they are descendants of African Americans or loyalists who had migrated from Canada and in North America. Thomas Jefferson, of course, with his racist self, referred to the black loyalists as the fugitives from these states. Of course he would. Recaptured African slave loyalists were captured by Patriot slave traders and who were sold back into slavery and treated harshly for serving under the British for trying to gain freedom in the first place. Heaven forbid you do not want to be enslaved in bondage. And of course they come up with some nonsense called drapetomania, where it's some sickness that the African had who ever tried to escape slavery. They mastered pseudoscience. But anyway, so they were put back in bondage for fighting on behalf of the British. Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. I love this painting. You see this brother right here on the left-hand side? No joke. He's got a rifle in his hand fighting on behalf of the Loyalists. John Murray, Earl of Dunmore, the last governor of Virginia, formed the term Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. In 1775, this regiment was formed for several hundred slaves who escaped their servitude to join them. All right? He fled to Williamsburg to organize a small army of loyalists and British soldiers on the coast near Norfolk. So you got black and white hand side to side fighting. Dunmore published a proclamation in November promising freedom to servants and slaves able to bear arms and enough to join him to make up of the force that first routed in Virginia militia at Kemp's Landing. All right? Dunmore, he reported to London that there were nearly 300 men of Ethiopian regiment dressed in clad uniforms embroidered liberty to slaves. Patriots reacted in fear and fury to the threat posed by the first systematic freeing and armament of the South Blacks labor force. All right? 12,000 blacks served with the British forces in North America during the Revolutionary War. And after they were received by the British, it prompted the Continental Congress in 1775. So a lot of black people down in the South and North were joining forces with the British and and of course being a part of this regiment because they would promise freedom. And many of the patriots who fought on behalf of the colonists here in the Americas was put back into slavery. Some was free, some was put back into slavery. You know, it's just the nature of the beast. Here's a copy of the Proclamation by Lord Dunmore's. I found this, and I'm going to increase the size of this so you can see it, or you can either Google it yourself and see it. I thought it was pretty cool. The Continental Congress of 1777. This is where it was to rescind. The Continental Congress of 1777 was to rescind its November 1775 declaration. All right, that blacks were ineligible to serve in the Continental Army, and led to the first significant enrollments of free blacks and then slaves in the Patriot forces. So they came back 2 years later and said, you know what? You are eligible. Let's go. We need your help. Here's some reenactments of modern day black men playing as loyalists. You'll see a lot of this down in Williamsburg, Virginia, down at Busch Gardens, and throughout the South, you know, in Maryland area and Massachusetts, stuff like that, where it was prominent. Thomas Peters, 1738 to 1792, one of my favorites. You'll see just one bit. I loved all of them, but this is definitely one of my favorites. He was a black loyalist. He was the founding father of the nation of Sierra Leone in West Africa. He recruited African settlers in the province of Nova Scotia for the colonization of Sierra Leone. He was a former slave in America. He fled to North Carolina, my part of the world, with the British during the Revolutionary War. He served as a black loyalist in the Black Company of Pioneers and later becoming a prominent black colonial leader in Freetown. Thomas Peters has been called the first African-American hero for what he was doing. Just powerful. You have Seymour Burr. His date kind of unknown, between 1754 to 1762. His death was in 1837. He was an African-American slave from Connecticut colony in North America, British colonies, and United States. He was owned by the brother of Colonel Aaron Burr, also known as Seymour. And his owner, fearing that Seymour would escape again, offered him money to buy his freedom only if he fought against the British Army. However, he later escaped, and he used the surname Burr to enlist in the British Army, becoming a loyalist. And he fought at Bunker Hill, Fort Catskill, and Valley Forge. You keep your money, I'm still leaving. You had this man by the name of David George. And this is Silver Bluff Church. All right? Why is this so significant? He was an African-American Baptist preacher and a black loyalist for the South. He escaped to the British lines in Savannah, Georgia. Later accepted transport to Nova Scotia. He resettled in Freetown, Sierra Leone. He founded the Silver Bluff Baptist Church in South Carolina in 1775. This, of course, was the first black congregation in present-day United States. Okay. Then you had Moses Wilkinson, 1746 or 1747. Unfortunately, his death is unknown. Moses' daddy Wilkinson was he was also called Old Moses, African American slave and Wesleyan Methodist preacher in North Nova Scotia and Sierra Leone. You will find that a lot of African Americans were either Baptist or Methodist. And there's some history behind that because those were the primary two denominations of Christianity that was fighting for the abolition of the African Americans. So since they were fighting for the freedom of the African slave, many Africans joined into becoming Baptists and Methodists. That in a nutshell, that's why a lot of black people are down south were particularly Baptists or Methodists. All right, and also too, you're in your Baptist and Methodist congregation, they still had connection to a lot of African traditions, dance, music, stuff like that. If you don't believe me, go to a Baptist church and just stand by for the next 3 hours. Okay? All right, so after the Dunmore's proclamation, Wilkinson led a band of runaway slaves to freedom in 1776. He was blind and lame, okay? But yet, he had the courage to lead a band of runaway slaves in freedom in 1776. When the British were defeated in 1783, Wilkinson and other black loyalists were transported to Halifax. All right, so the British helped them get out of here because they were going to get persecuted for it. He's listed in the Book of Negroes. He's a black loyalist settlement was established in Birchtown, Nova Scotia. All right. The black loyalists at Birchtown, after the American Revolution in over 3,500 free African American loyal to the crown moved to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, where they established the first black communities in Canada. Birchtown was founded in 1783. It was the largest and most influential of these settlements. Here's a picture of some of your black loyalists in Birchtown. Here's a map of the black loyalist settlement in Nova Scotia. You'll see the yellow circles. This is where their communities were located, and the red squares are where they were landing. Also, there's a video on my channel called "The History of Black Hockey." I need you to go and take a look at that video where I'm giving you the history of black hockey, but I'm also touching bases on some of the loyalists in Birchtown and what they were doing and how they contributed to modern day hockey. In fact, many of the moves that you see today, they invented them, including when Europeans was doing hockey, the goalie wasn't allowed to leave their feet. The black loyalist was doing that, and then that particular movement was adopted by the white hockey players, and then of course later on, about 30 years later, they established the NHL, and they started doing a lot of the moves what black hockey players was doing. All right, so then you have the black loyalists. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that is a fact. So here's the end of my presentation. If there's any questions and discussion on this, I'd definitely love to hear from you guys. Definitely leave a comment on the bottom of in the chat. If you want to add more to the discussion, I'm definitely looking forward to hearing from what you have. I can't cover all of that without boring you to death. I didn't want to, but I wanted to also just give you a synopsis of some of the heroes in the Revolutionary War and their significance, the difference between a patriot and a loyalist, and in my humble opinion, why the Revolutionary War began. So thank you for tuning in. Also, like, share, subscribe to the channel. I'm going to leave a couple of links in the bottom for you to purchase some of the books that I think will be significant on you learning much of this history, and also download the Dark Warrior Perspective app, both in the Apple Store and the Google Store. I appreciate it. Thank you.